Let's learn all about functions in C#. So like usual, let's start off by asking ourselves what are functions and why do we use them? So you can think of a function like a variable, but instead of just holding a single value like the string hello or the number 7, functions will contain lines of code. So functions are just reusable bits of code. Just like loops, they will enable us to make our code dry. So imagine in your script, you need to calculate the distance between two objects. And so you wrote down all the calculations and you made everything work correctly. But now say that you needed the same calculations but for two other objects. You would have to copy and paste the same code twice in your script, which is not dry code. So functions enable us to write the code once. We basically define what the function is, and then each time we need that code, we can just call the function. So in the example I was talking about, we would have a function called calculateDistance, and it would contain all the code necessary for calculating distances. And then each time we would need that functionality, we would simply call the function. Alright, let's have a look at the syntax for defining a function. We first of all start with the keyword void, and then we write the name of the function. So this can be anything you want, and the convention is to start each word with a capital letter. So in this example, I'm going to call it welcome player. Once that is done, we put a pair of parentheses, and of course, you guessed it, we put a pair of curly brackets. This is a structure to define a function. Now all that we need to do is fill in our function with the code that we want. So in this example, I'm creating a function that is welcoming a player, so I'll just write a couple of print lines. So if I would save our script like this and press play, nothing would get printed out because we have just defined our function. We now need to call this function. So for example, I can now go inside the start function, and the way we call a function is simply by writing the name of the function, then adding a pair of parentheses, and of course a semicolon. You can of course call the function as many times as you want. Okay, so this is the most basic type of function. You just define it, give it some lines of code, and then each time you want to use that code, you just call it. Often we want our functions to be able to take inputs. This is where functions with arguments come into place. So in the example function we talked about just before, we were welcoming the player called Bob. But what if we wanted to choose what player we wanted to welcome each time we called the function? What if we wanted to personalize the welcoming? So to enable us to do that, we can make our function take in arguments. Arguments are just like variables, but these variables only exist inside of the function you're creating them in. So to create an argument, you go inside the parentheses, and like for a variable, you first state the type of argument. So is it a string, an integer, a float, or a bool? And of course, you give it a name. So in this case, I'll create a string argument called player name. Now remember, this argument only exists inside of this function. So now I can replace Bob with the argument's player name. Now that this is done, when we call the function, we can pass in the value that we want for player name. So for example, the first player that I want to welcome is called Sam, so I would just add a string Sam inside of the parentheses, and the second player that I want to welcome is called Charlie, so I would just type in Charlie. So basically, each time we call a function, we feed in a value for the arguments. Of course, you can have as many arguments as you like, you just have to separate them with commas. Okay, let's now talk about the last type of function, which are functions that return a value. So for now, the functions that we have talked about have just ran some code. In one case, it doesn't take any input, and in the other, it does. But we can also create functions that return a value, which means that they send back some outputs. You can actually think of a function like a machine. They take in some inputs, then they perform some calculations, they run some code or whatever, and then they send back some outputs. So for now, we have been creating functions that don't return any outputs, and that is why we are using the keyword voids. So each time you want to create a function that doesn't need to return any particular value, you just use the keyword voids. But for example, imagine you wanted to create a function that takes in two numbers, adds them up together, and then returns as outputs the result of that addition. The way we do this is as follows. Because we are going to be returning a number, we have to either use the int or float keywords. Let's do int for this example. Then we just give the function a name like before, so I'll call it add. Then let's add our parentheses and then our pair of curly brackets. We said that we wanted our function to take in as input two numbers, so I'll create two integer parameters, one called number1 and another called number2. Then what this function is going to do is very simple. We're just going to create an integer variable called result that is going to be equal to number1 plus number2. The way that we return this result variable as output is by saying return outputs. It's as simple as that. It's the keyword return that makes the magic happen. Now that we are sending back some outputs, we can actually store that output in a variable, for example. So instead of the start function, I can create an integer variable called function result, which is equal to the add function, and I'm going to pass in for the parameters 5 and 10. So 5 plus 10 is 15, and because we are sending that output, well, now our variable function result is going to be equal to 15. Alright, enough talking. The best way to understand all this is by writing some code, so let's jump into Unity. Okay, so here I am, and I'm going to create a new C# script called functions, and then let's open it up inside of our text editor. Okay, so in this video, we're going to create a small health system. The first thing that I'll do is to create an integer variable called health that I'll set equal to 10 at the start. Okay, let's create a function that will enable us to take damage. So I'm going to start off by creating a function that doesn't return anything, so I'll type in the keyword void. Then I'll call my function take damage, and after that I'll add a pair of parentheses and a pair of curly brackets. The function is going to start off by subtracting 1 from our health variable. So I can say health equals health minus 1, or like we already saw, we can say health minus equals 1. And then I'll print out to Unity console, ouch, you took damage, you're now down 2, and I'll concatenate the health variable. Okay, we're done with our take damage function for now. Let's say that we want to call this function each time we press the spacebar key. So if you remember from the hot and cold number guessing game, we will go inside of the update function and I'll say if input.getKeyDown, and inside of the parentheses, I'll pass in the string space. Alright, so whenever we press down the spacebar button, I'll simply call the take damage function. Okay, let's save our script and go back to Unity. Remember to remove any old script and to drag and drop the new one onto an object in the scene, and now let's press play. If we now press the space button while we are focused inside of the game view, we can see that we have subtracted 1 from our health, and we are now printing that we only have 9 health left. If we press again, we can see that we've got 8 health and so on. Okay, this is cool, but let's now allow our take damage function to take in an argument so that we can change the amount of damage that we are taking each time we press the space key. So I'll just add inside of the parentheses an integer parameter called damage. And then instead of just subtracting 1 from the health variable, I'll subtract the parameter damage. So now when we're calling the take damage function, we can give our damage parameter a value. So instead of just hard coding a value, let's create a public integer variable called damage amount. Now add that variable for the value of the parameter. So now each time we press the spacebar button, we're going to call the take damage function with the value of the damage parameter being the damage amount variable. Let's now save our script and test this out. I'm going to choose 5 for the damage amount, and if I now press play, we can see that the player took 5 damage and he now has only 5 health left. Okay, let's do one last thing. Let's create a function that will return a bool, so either true or false, depending on if the player is dead. So in other words, if he has got 0 health. So because we will be returning a bool, I'll use the bool keywords. Then I'm going to call my function isDead, and it will not take in any arguments. The function is going to be super simple. We're going to check if the health variable is less than or equal to 0. And if it is, then we will print out true. Else, if it isn't less than or equal to 0, then we will return false because the player isn't dead. So now, each time we press the spacebar key, we will first of all deal the damage to the player using the take damage function. Then we will print to Unity console player dead, and then we will concatenate the isDead function. So just like we can concatenate variables, we can also concatenate functions to return values. So this line will either say player dead true or player dead false, depending on the health of the player. Okay, so let's now save our script one last time and let's test this out. So let's start off by taking 4 damage. And as you can see, we have got 6 health left, and the isDead function is returning false because we are not dead. But now, if we deal another 6 damage, this time we are dead. Okay, that's it. Let's now quickly conclude this video. So what you have to take away is that functions are just reusable pieces of code that let us dry up our codes. We first of all define the function, and then each time we need to use the code, we can just call that function. We can create simple functions that just runs code. We can create functions that take in arguments as input, and we can also create functions that send back output using the return keywords. Anyways, this was just a deep dive into functions. In the next video, you'll have an exercise where you'll have lots of functions that you'll have to create on your own. So don't worry, we have just started to learn about functions. Okay, anyways, this is all for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.